The town of Fowl Glen has a reputation free of scandal, surrounded by gentle hills and a maze of hedgerows. Every year, the gardeners' show, or, every once in a while, a lost package at the post office was the main event. However, the reopening of the Lace Museum provided the townspeople with something more substantial to discuss today. Towards the end of Mallow Street was a light-filled building encircled with ivy. Bobbins, samplers, and rare antique lace from all around the county are currently housed in what was once the old rectory. Reopened after a lengthy closure for repairs and an unusual funding dispute, it piqued the mild interest of the locals and, in particular, Miss Jane Marple, who had long thought lace to be somewhat exposing. Everything was held together despite all the holes. The village was filled with the aroma of damp earth and chimney smoke on the morning of the event, carried by a crisp autumn breeze. Opening time for the museum was 10 o'clock. Subtle murmurs of praise and the faint clinking of china cups filled the exhibit area by 10 o'clock. At precisely 10 minutes past the hour, Miss Marple, clad in a dove-grey coat, came, her handbag clutched like a symphony of tranquility. She sat down next to the lengthy display table of hand-woven lace collars, grabbed a cup of weak tea from the vicar's wife, and mumbled something nice about the cucumber sandwiches. She wasn't the only one who felt the tension in the room. She just didn't want to ignore it. The imposing museum curator, Mrs. Cordelia Fawcett, stood beside the main display, standing tall with the stiff posture often seen in Victorian-era portraits. Mrs. Fawcett accessorized with a string of jet beads and a slender black gown. With a clipped precision, she greeted guests, her eyes darting over their shoulders as she spoke. Close to the hearth, the Reverend Giles Maynard appeared to be in discomfort as he sipped his tea. Like a moth that has become addicted to lights, his wife Dora fluttered by his side. What a victory for Cordelia, she murmured to herself, particularly in light of the difficulties surrounding the financing, near the snack bar. The museum's finance secretary, Edward Blake, stood rigidly. With self-control, he combed his receding hairline, and he stared at the wine glass for an extra second, even though tea was the only beverage on the table. The attention of Miss Marple was fixed on a display situated in the corner. The delicately stitched characters on a framed sampler have a little fading thread. Virtue is a lace that never unravels. She thought that was hilariously ironic. Out of nowhere, there was a heated argument behind her, interrupting her train of thought. "Not Agnes, you were not allowed to touch that part." In a flash, Mrs. Fawcett snapped. She spoke softly, but with the force of starched linen. Teenage girl Belle Agnes, as she swiftly withdrew her hand from a glass-encased lace fan. The museum assistant eye was merely adjusting the label. With a flushed face, Agnes whispered there was deceit in it, and Mrs. Fawcett's pupils narrowed as she said, "These pieces are delicate. Your role does not include handling them. Please remember that." Then came a strange quiet. Coughing into his sleeve, the Reverend someone made a slightly too audible pour of tea. Miss Marple leisurely drank hers. She noted the tremble in Agnes's hand, the slight twitch at the corner of Mrs. Fawcett's mouth, and away. Mr. Blake busied himself polishing an already clean teaspoon, something she thought had frayed beneath the surface. Later that afternoon, after the guests had wandered off and the museum doors were locked once more, Miss Marple walked home beneath a sky turning the colour of faded lavender. The leaves underfoot were crisp. She thought about the lace fan. Victorian most likely, but there was something unusual about the pattern. Or had it been the positioning? She brushed the thought aside. Perhaps it was only that Mrs. Fawcett had been unusually short-tempered. Or perhaps a sound interrupted her thoughts. A sharp, distant scream. It came from the direction of the museum. Miss Marple paused. A gust of wind stirred the hem of her skirt, then silence. She waited, listened, nothing more. The village would learn the next morning that Mrs. Cordelia Fawcett had been found dead, slumped in her office chair. The cause a sudden cardiac event, the doctor would say. Most unfortunate, but not uncommon in women of her age. Miss Marple, however, was not convinced. She'd seen the lacework, she'd heard the scream, and she'd noticed that the glass case with the fan had been quietly removed from the main exhibit by morning before moving next detective. Where in the world are you solving mysteries with us? Drop your location in the comments, and if you crave more Twisted Tales, hit subscribe. Tomorrow's case file is even darker. Stay sharp. Chapter 2 by 9. The next morning, the death of Mrs. Cordelia Fawcett had travelled faster than the milk cart. The notice was posted at the grocer's. By 8 by 9:15, Mrs. Petherbridge was knocking on Miss Marple's door, breathless and damp with urgency despite the mild weather. Have you heard? She asked, without preamble, cheeks flushed like stewed plums, about Cordelia Marple, who had just sat down to butter her toast, gave a soft nod. Yes, such a sudden thing, quite distressing. Distressing, Mrs. Petherbridge echoed, dropping heavily into the chair opposite her. My cousin Enid was at the museum when it happened, you know. Says the body was still warm when Agnes Bell found her stiff in the office like a broken puppet, they say. Her mouth was open like she'd been startled, not just gone quietly. Miss Marple offered tea. Mrs. Petherbridge waved it off. To invest it now, to pause. Dr. Fulbright says her heart gave out, but I don't like it. Cordelia may have been a difficult woman, but she was always sharp. And you heard about the lace fan, didn't you? Miss Marple set her cup down gently. What about it? Gone, vanished. They've removed the whole case. Agnes told Enid that Edward Blake ordered it boxed up. Before the police arrived, she lowered her voice, as if even the wallpaper might gossip. And the fan was hers, you know. Cordelia's private donation. Had it since before she came here, some say. It wasn't quite legitimate how she acquired it. Miss Marple didn't reply at once. Instead, she spread a thin layer of marmalade across her toast. I wonder what prompted such urgency exactly, and Agnes looked like she hadn't slept a wink. The girls' hands were shaking when she handed over the museum keys. Something's off. I feel it in my bones. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Bones are often more reliable than people think. By midday, the village air had turned brittle with suspicion. Small clusters of conversation dotted the high street like fallen apples, bruised, whispered over, and quietly stepped round at Cresswell's stationery and gifts. Two customers murmured behind a rack of garden-themed thank you cards. I'm telling you, it wasn't natural, said Mrs. Goodwin, a large woman with too many rings. Did you see the shade of her face? Not a heart attack, poison. Oh, don't be morbid, her companion replied, not convincingly. At the post office, Reverend Maynard stood rigid beside the parcel counter, brows furrowed as the clerk fumbled with stamps. I'm simply saying, he muttered to no one in particular, that Mrs. Fawcett was not the kind to overexert herself. Something must have brought it on stress. Perhaps she had enemies, you know. Back at the vicarage, Dora Maynard had already composed a list of potential motives and tucked it behind the pantry jam labels. Just in case the police are inefficient, she told her husband. Miss Marple, meanwhile, paid a quiet visit to the lace museum that afternoon. The front door remained locked, but Agnes Bell was there, sorting paperwork in the narrow reception hall. Her eyes were ringing with sleeplessness, and her voice carried the tautness of someone waiting for a door to slam behind them. I wasn't expecting anyone today, she said as she opened the door, unsure whether to be annoyed or grateful. I won't stay long, Miss Marple said softly. What, I only wanted to offer my condolences. You must have cared for Mrs. Fawcett very much. Agnes hesitated. She was particular, but I respected her. Miss Marple nodded, pausing. A great deal of responsibility has fallen to you now. Agnes's gaze dropped to the ledger on the desk. Mr. Blake's handling most of it, said. I should focus on inventory. Inventory, Miss Marple echoed. The fan collection. Perhaps Agnes blinked just once. Those were her favorites, she said. Each one told a story. And now the stories are packed away. Agnes offered a weak smile. Mr. Blake said it was best not to overwhelm the inspectors. Miss Marple let her gaze rest on the young woman. Did she have any visitors recently? Anyone not part of the museum board? Agnes hesitated a fraction too long. No, not that I know of. Miss Marple said nothing more. Instead, she reached into her bag, drew out a wrapped tin of currant biscuits, and placed it on the counter. Something sweet. You look like you haven't had a proper breakfast. When she stepped outside, the door closed behind her with a sigh, as if even the building was tired of the murmurs. That evening, the local constable, Sergeant Webb, came to visit Miss Marple with a notebook too new for comfort. He was not from Fellow Glen, having been assigned from a nearby town. Only a month prior, he bore the fresh shine of procedural training and an unfortunate distrust of old ladies. Miss Marple, he said, clearing his throat, just following up with key witnesses. Mrs. Thurbridge mentioned you were present at the museum event. I was, she said, folding her hands neatly in her lap. Did you see anything unusual? Many things, Sergeant, she replied, but nothing I would describe as officially suspicious. He blinked. Meaning? She said gently that some people are often more revealing when they believe they're saying nothing at all. He frowned, unsure whether she was mocking him. Well, doctor says it was a heart attack. Clean as you like. I'm sure he did, she replied, sipping her tea. Sergeant Webb flipped a page. That Agnes girl seems nervous. You think she's hiding something? Miss Marple considered. I think she's afraid there isn't. Always the same thing. Scratched the side of his jaw. We'll keep looking into it. I expect it'll all settle down in a few days. I hope not too quickly, she murmured. He didn't ask what she meant. Perhaps it was just as well. By nightfall, rain tapped softly at the windows of the village cottages. In the darkness of her sitting room, Miss Marple sat beside the fire, darning a woolen cuff. On the table beside her was a folded newspaper, a time-marked chamomile, and a single matchstick, slightly scorched, yet unstuck. She glanced at it, then very softly she smiled. Chapter 3. By the third day, the official story had settled into place like poorly ironed linen. Heart failure, the villagers repeated, not quite believing it, but unwilling to contradict the doctor. The more skeptical ones added, while she was under stress, as if stress had become a suitable stand-in for murder. Miss Marple, of course, was not satisfied with neat explanations that ignored untidy truths. That morning, she made a quiet call on Mr. Edward Blake, the museum's financial secretary. His cottage was just past the village green, neat, symmetrical, and entirely devoid of warmth. Mr. Blake had a garden no one walked in, and a wife no one had seen in nearly a year, though rumour insisted she was recuperating in Bath. He greeted Miss Marple at the door in shirt sleeves, a pencil behind one ear. His smile was professional and just slightly over-aimed. Miss Marple, this is unexpected. I do hope I'm not intruding, she said, though her tone made it clear she knew she was not at all just going over the donation ledger. He gestured toward the sitting room, but did not offer tea. The room was sparse and exacting. Books arranged by spine color, a clock ticking 1 second ahead of its echo. I understand you've taken on quite the responsibility at the museum. She began, settling into the edge of the armchair. Temporarily, yes, Blake replied, smoothing his shirt cuff. Agnes is handling admin, but the board agreed I should coordinate the transition. It's all very sudden. Of course, yes, Miss Marple said softly. Sudden things often are. He didn't respond. She let a brief silence stretch before continuing. I've always found lace fascinating, so precise, so delicate. And yet the tiniest flaw can unravel the whole thing. Blake offered a stiff smile. An apt metaphor. I noticed the lace fan is no longer on display. It was such a lovely piece. Cordelia spoke of it with great pride. His smile thinned. The fan has been secured. Standard procedure. Valuable items are withdrawn during police reviews, but she donated it, didn't she, some years ago? A pause. Privately, yes. There was no formal paperwork, but the museum considered it part of her legacy, yet you packed it away immediately. Blake's jaw moved faintly. We had no reason to believe it was relevant. Of course, she said mildly, though sometimes the most irrelevant things turn out to be the most illuminating. She stood. I won't take up any more of your time, but I wonder, did Mrs. Fawcett ever mention feeling unsafe or threatened? Blake looked briefly surprised. No, she was quite firm on boundaries. She didn't concern herself with gossip or small threats. She was Cordelia. Miss Marple nodded, as if that answered everything. Thank you, Mr. Blake. She left the cottage with more questions. Then she'd arrived with the fan, had been removed too quickly, the donation undocumented, and Edward Blake had been too rehearsed to tidy. Miss Marple thought. And human nature, as she well knew, was anything but tidy. She made her way next to the vehicle, where Dora Maynard greeted her with the enthusiasm of someone expecting to be useful. Oh, Jane, do come in. I've been sorting through the old church archives, trying to find that record of the museum's founding. Committee. Fascinating how things begin. Isn't it so much hope? And then, will people get involved? Indeed, Miss Marple said. It's people who always spoil institutions. Dora giggled, then lowered her voice. Between you and me, I never quite trusted. Cordelia always thought she held the whole village in contempt. Even her compliments felt like sharpened teaspoons. Miss Marple accepted her tea without sugar and took a measured sip. Did she have close relationships, friends? Hardly tolerated some, dismissed most. She and Agnes were thick as thieves for a while. Then something changed. A row about a display, I think. Cordelia said Agnes was getting ideas, said museums weren't for sentiment. Ah, Miss Marple said softly, and yet sentiment is what draws people back. Dora tilted forward. Edward claimed that Cordelia was going to the printer the night before she passed away, but the printer claims that she never made it. That happened after she was spotted wandering alone near the allotments. Did she make any remarks to you while you were there? As Dora scowled, the one peculiarity of lace, looking at an older example, she remarked, "You can always tell the difference between what's handmade and what's cleverly faked." As she stepped away, Miss Marple's fingers lingered on her cup's handle. Quizzically, she whispered, "How curious." Later that day, Miss Marple went for a stroll around the museum grounds, which were now surrounded by a delicate cloak that resembled weathered bone. The sky was overcast, but the rain hadn't yet started to pour. She remained in front of the structure for a while, staring at the rear, where a second-floor sash was slightly ajar, rather than the main windows. At night, the museum was unmanned. Even though Mrs. Fawcett had said it wasn't necessary, she was sure someone had been there late. Back toward the road she turned, when a voice behind her cried out, "Miss Marple." Reluctantly, Agnes Bell, clad in an overly delicate shawl, made her way outside. For some reason, Agnes felt the urge to murmur, "I shouldn't be here, but I need to talk to someone who will listen." Her eyes briefly glanced behind her, as if scanning the street. The arm of Miss Marple was extended. "Together, we will traverse for a few moments." Agnes remained silent. Before she finally let out a breath, they went past a row of bushes. Cordelia probably felt nervous about saying it out. Actually, last week she changed the locks and began keeping the fan in her office overnight. Agnes shook her head and said that things were becoming messy, but she didn't specify why. I don't know who she was referring to, but she added that she had made a mistake years ago and now it was finally hitting her. Agnes whispered, "Don't trust Mr. Blake." Just the day before she passed away, they came to a halt in their movement. Agnes averted her eyes as Miss Marple tilted her head slightly to observe her face. "Then why haven't you told the police?" she asked. "I believe I was the last person to see her alive, and that's why Part 4, the very following morning, Agnes Bell was hauled in for questioning. It wasn't an official arrest, not yet, but in a village. Like FAU, Glen, it didn't need to be. The public's opinion was already formed when Sergeant Webb led her from the museum office to the parish hall for a private meeting. "Poor girl," whispered Mrs. Goodwin, who was already on her way to the baker's, "but she's always been a bit odd, hasn't she? Very quiet and always hovering near Cordelia. Only she had seen her alive before." To top it all off, Dora Maynard didn't even break down when the funeral announcement included a voice from behind her. She proceeded to tell the ladies at the sewing circle as if the information had been hers alone and she had inherited nothing. Oh, that's so revealing. By midday, Agnes had transformed into a handy villain, her character constructed from hints and strained looks. They claimed she was ambitious, had opportunities, and was hiding something. On the other hand, Miss Marple was not one to so quickly. She observed from a quiet spot near the rear of the parish hall as Sergeant Webb frantically turned pages in his notebook. Agnes sat across from him at the table, her shoulders hunched like a sheet of paper left out in the rain. She held a handkerchief in her hands, but never used it. "I just want to be clear," the sergeant said, tapping his pencil. "Aside from Mr. Blake, who claims to have left shortly after closing, you were the last person known to see Mrs. Fawcett alive," Ignis explained. "I was finishing the display logs." She spoke in a steady, faraway tone. "Because she needed to check the safe, she urged me to return home. It was just after 6 o'clock, and I departed through the side entrance. Nobody else appeared thereafter." Without looking up, Webb typed something. "What time did you arrive home?" At about 6:30, from behind, he let out a non-committal grunt, and Agnes hesitated, saying, "I live alone." Miss Marple moved her weight slightly, the stream of a floorboard, the only clue of her existence. Webb leaned back. "Something is important for you to understand, Miss Bell. Digitalis foxglove remnants were discovered, according to the coroner's report, which was received this morning. Not enough to have an immediate effect, but a steady dosage could cause heart failure-like symptoms in the long run, completely undetectable until specifically sought out." As Agnes slowly blinked, she glanced at him. "I have no idea what you're talking about. Close to the allotments, it has grown wild. On the night of her death, you went past them." A small furrow appeared on Miss Marple's brow. It was a minor adjustment how the language had gone from "did she" to "you," Webb went on. "The tea in Cordelia's office had a hint of it, and we discovered unmarked, loose leaves." Subtly, Agnes began to speak. According to Miss Marple, that was not what Mr. Blake stated, and she refused to allow anyone touch her tea. "Has Mr. Blake provided any examples of his handwriting?" With a blink, Sergeant Webb, "What for comparison? I mean, on the museum logs, or on the shipment forms?" "I ask simply because Mrs. Fawcett revealed to Agnes that someone had tampered with donation records," before frowning. "Webb, I am unaware of that, and—" "Maybe," Miss Marple whispered, "the way you're posing your inquiries is incorrect." Miss Marple gracefully slid onto the edge of the bench, joining Agnes, who sat on the stone steps, her face turning pale in the afternoon light. "It was rude of you to interrupt, Agnes," said Agnes, betrayed her shame by offering a pitiful smile, implying that things will only get worse now. "Everyone is so impatient, isn't it? When I was quiet and helpful, people liked me more. Glancing aside from the hall, Miss Marple caught sight of the road that led away. People want stories they can carry in their pockets. I got the impression that you've always been a little bit too big for it, and Agnes gave her a doubtful glance. Miss Marple continued, even though the fan wasn't visible during the reception. Edward Blake insisted it was on exhibit the morning of Cordelia's death, contradicting what you said about her recent lock change. I wonder, did she perhaps remove it the night before? She did, Agnes whispered. According to her, the figures didn't add up. She said that despite turning it over, Miss Marple never clarified her meaning. Know only that if anything happened to her, follow the fan. Do you believe I'm being framed? At last, Agnes spoke. It seems like someone is hoping the villagers won't notice if you're perfectly cast as the evil. Later that evening, Sergeant Webb knocked on Miss Marple's door. Not only was his notepad absent this time, but he appeared weary, with wrinkles at the corners and a hint of moisture from the rain. I don't suppose you have any tea, he remarked. I do, she answered, and I steep it properly. The gentle hum of the fire accompanied their sitting in the cozy parlour. Webb breathed. I don't like it. There's something strange about Blake, all too routine. And that ledger, I took a peek, scrubbed and rewritten entries to checks that were post-dated. Only the originals will do. A warrant is required. He barely spoke. He was given a biscuit tin by Miss Marple. Being patient is then essential. Making the correct choice could be a lengthy process. Rising, Webb peered. You believe Agnes is blameless. I perceive her as timid, perceptive, and uncalculating. That is not at all how this offence was. She wanted control of the museum and didn't even struggle to preserve her position. According to Webb, who drummed his fingers on the armrest, half of the community said she was envious of Cordelia. Miss Marple claimed she let Blake take control the instant Cordelia died. No, he agreed. It doesn't, and Miss Marple barely cracked a smile. Then maybe there's more to the story. This is just the beginning of our journey of confusion. Sergeant the Astute section follows Chapter 5. The next day, overcast skies and a persistent drizzle transformed garden pathways into muck, causing the postman to mutter expletives. Despite this, Miss Marple thought the rain was perfect for contemplation. She sat by the parlour window, knitting needles lying in her lap, her gaze focused not on the garden beyond, but on a recollection from 2 days past. Everyone at the reception thought the lace fan was just a minor detail, but Miss Marple had known. For a long time, that truth frequently hides its face in minor things. Then, for some reason, it vanished. She rose and crossed to her writing bureau from a small stack of museum pamphlets acquired over the years. She removed one from the prior season's exhibit, a catalogue detailing important objects on loan and gift. Dated March, she paused at an entry headed fan number 12 as she flipped through the fragile pages. Vintage, Victorian-era black chantil, lace and autograph from Cordelia Fawcett. Controversy surrounds the donor's identity and the continent's potential interest. Why identify the donor as anonymous and dispute the origin, since Mrs. Fawcett insisted? The fan was hers from the beginning, even before the museum bought it. The words appeared well chosen despite her flaws. Cordelia possessed the accuracy of a librarian. Without a compelling purpose to conceal the truth, she would never have let such ambiguity to appear in paper. Later that day, Miss Marple stopped by the grocer's under the excuse of needing ginger biscuits, despite her almost obsessive devotion to precision. Mrs. Calthorpe, who oversaw the counter, was more than happy to strike up a conversation. Terrible business, that museum mess, she remarked as she weighed out a £1/4 into brown paper. Though I never trusted that lace fan, you know, bad energy. Little Miss Marple whispered, Oh, Asking during its spring display, they proudly displayed it in the front cabinet. Then suddenly, it vanished. Completely disappeared back again 2 weeks later. Still no clarity. Suddenly, Miss Marple's eyes widened. Vanished, while Agnes informed me that it was for cleaning. I overheard Mrs. Calthorpe in the shop mentioning that it had been misfiled. Envisioned the anguish of losing anything of that kind. To them, it was priceless. Miss Marple placed the paper-wrapped biscuits inside her bag. Things like that are easy to ignore, I guess. Yet that fan has a history. Mark my words, some say it belonged to a dancer. The fact that no one is named as the donor suggests that it may have once belonged to a French estate that was looted during the war. Edward allowed staff and board members restricted access to the Lace Museum once it reopened at precisely 3 o'clock. Miss Marple came at the museum at precisely 3 o'clock. Standing at the door, Blake conversed with a trustee. His smile wavered when he saw her. I thought this was a restricted access day. He said, "Oh, I'm not here to touch anything." Miss Marple replied sweetly, "Just to ask a small question." She pointed to the back hallway and asked, "Could we have a conversation where there are fewer ears?" He complied, escorting her to a shadowy storage room adorned with dusty shelves containing various artifacts. "I was curious," she said, turning to face him, "concerning the admirer. The exact date of its acquisition by the museum appears to be a point of contention." Blake's voice became tense. Because it was a private present, Cordelia probably didn't want its formal recording done when she gave it. As I indicated earlier, donor identity and provenance remain unclear in the spring catalogue. Blake hesitated. That was her doing. That is a grave accusation, and she was worried that there might be problems with provenance or theft. Without flinching, Miss Marple murdered two between them. There was a long period of quiet. A subtle twitch appeared on Blake's face. She persisted in her investigation into the fan's background. Found something she didn't expect. I wouldn't know. While perusing the museum's mail, Miss Marple's eyes landed on a stack of letters that were still in their brown envelopes. Was Laffer ever a name she brought up? A split second of his expressionless face was all it took. He said she hadn't. Thus it followed that she had later that night. Miss Marple extended an invitation to Sergeant Webb to come to the vicarage with her. There, Reverend Maynard was enjoying his second brandy, and Dora had insisted on cleaning all day as a means of improving her thoughts. In her mind, the fan had been stolen. Although she had started researching the Maynards' history, Miss Marple informed Webb in a low voice as they sat in the conservatory. "I kept seeing the French surname Lear. Cordelia had written to someone in Dover who deals in reclaimed estate things. Could be connected to war loot. Webb murmured, or private sales. Agnes claims that in her last days on the job, she slept with the fan in her office, a habit she maintained throughout her profession. That goes beyond just feeling it's terrifying." Webb nodded slowly. "You think someone found out she was digging?" As Miss Marple responded, "I think someone needed the fan to disappear." Cordelia was adamant about holding on to it. The next morning, a museum intern spotted a scorched fragment of lace cloth under the museum boiler, blackened but obviously patented, with Sergeant Webb by her side. Miss Marple examined the item and uttered, "Only even lace leaves, ashes, if one knows where to look." Part 6. It was the finding of the burned lace under the museum boiler that shocked the villagers, more than the actual death itself. Someone tried to destroy evidence, Dora Maynard remarked during tea, indicating the existence of a crime. Or someone was simply cold and careless, the vicar responded, reaching for another sconstum. However, Miss Marple was the only one who didn't buy into the "not really." It looked like an awkward effort at hiding at first. However, Miss Marple had insight that others lacked. Not only did people not burn lace unless it had symbolic value, but the fire was about erasure, not destruction. The next day, Mrs. Thurbridge summoned Miss Marple under the premise of discussing hymnals, though it quickly became evident her concerns had less to do with music and more with Edward Blake. "Jane, I don't intend to pry, actually." "I do, but have you seen how Mr. Blake has pretty much taken over since Cordelia went away? His enthusiasm is palpable." What Miss Marple had to say, a passionate Mrs. Petherbridge threw up her hands. "Do you know what else he did? He rearranged the inventory system, went through every drawer, and cancelled the lecture on Belgian lace that was supposed to be next month, claiming it had nothing to do with the museum's objective." Leaning in closer, he was seen at the solicitor's office yesterday. No one knows why Miss Marple made a polite noise of inquiry, but it snuggled beside something sharper. As Reverend Maynard cut the roses in the churchyard with a subtle aggressiveness, she encountered him later that afternoon. "I always thought Cordelia had a strange hold over the village," he said. "Not exactly a romantic interest, but she had a knack for remembering details that others would rather forget, such as Miss Marple softly inquired thoughtfully. He paused, then said, "Let us just say that she kept more than just museum records. Photographs, letters, and a notebook of sorts were in her possession. She kept mum about it the whole time. Without him, I caught a glimpse of it in her drawer during a charity event. Dates, names, unusual notes, her words pierced my soul, as she declared, some truths need preserving even if the people attached to them don't." As Miss Marple whispered, "How very Cordelia," later that day, Agnes Bell went back to the museum for a little while to get some personal belongings. With Webb's okay, Miss Marple was waiting for her when she arrived, and the two of them strolled silently through the display room. Agnes paused at the pedestal, which was now empty, and whispered to a French contact that she was going to send the lace fan for identification. I personally addressed the package to her, but she never sent it. Why wouldn't she? Agnes shrugged. She stated that she needed to verify the donor's identity before proceeding. With a tilt of her head, Miss Marple asked, "Do you know who that was?" A moment of hesitation, Agnes pondered about the fact that it was a local, whom she dubbed an accidental thief. Miss Marple silently considered the possibility that the person had gotten their hands on a stolen item, maybe unknowingly, but chose not to return it after discovering the truth, indicating a mix of shame and dread. Sergeant Webb returned the following morning. He dropped upon Miss Marple's garden bench and grimaced, saying that she was blackmailing someone. Reverend Maynard brought up that ledger. The document was discovered in her office, concealed beneath a loose floorboard. It was locked, but not securely. Most of the codes were code names, but I believe I have deciphered one. The Nightingale Code relates to payments made last year from the museum's discretionary budget. Marple, Miss, blinking the use of museum funds for blackmail is quite bold. Cordelia Fawcett certainly had her self-assurance, as Miss Marple would attest. However, it was possible that she had finally crossed the line. The rumour mill in the village had reached a fever pitch before sunset. Now it was Reverend Maynard, not Agnes, who was at the centre. At the grocer's, Mrs. Goodwin murmured, "Of course, he was involved. He was under her influence. Most likely a gambling or love child. In no world are the church accounts ever accurate, are they?" One patron at the pub insisted they'd seen Mr. Blake on a ferry to Killala 2 winters ago, while another questioned whether he was using a false identity. Meanwhile, at Cresswell's stationery, a teen asserted that she had overheard Agnes sobbing in the back room, stating, "I didn't mean to hurt anyone." Nobody ever asked her why she had bothered to listen at all. As Miss Marple returned to her sitting room, she observed the crackling of the fire and jotted down the following: Lace Van timeline inconsistent. Cordelia was terrified of being exposed. Why was the fan taken down just before the victim passed away? Guilt over smoking shield ledger leverage. Not enduring ashes don't lie, but they distract her. Pause was brief. Below it, an additional line was written. How much more might that package contain? Agnes raced up Miss Marple's walk the following morning. Astonishing, untamed eyes last night. Someone broke into Cordelia's desk, she added, and they caught on to that. The package has disappeared. And Miss Marple nodded slowly, as if she hadn't heard a word. Then we're closer than they'd like, she pointed out, much closer. Chapter 7. A locked door was the first obstacle. Edward Blake did not show up for the museum board meeting that was supposed to take place by mid-morning, a regular meeting of the administrative staff called to address the impending winter displays and the short-term funding freeze for lace purchase. Agnes waited outside the office with the spare keys. When he still hadn't shown up by 10, she flipped the latch. Within, there was nothing changed. At first glance, the room appeared undisturbed. Books and papers arranged neatly. A subtle odor of smoke lingered in the air. Nevertheless, upon closer inspection, two things became apparent. First, the window was ajar, and second, Blake's outerwear and briefcase had vanished. Anxietyist Agnes took a step back. Blake had already disappeared, so there was no need for her to cry out. Sergeant Webb leaned over the desk with one hand and his hip resting on the other before midday. Coat case, umbrella, all gone, he whispered. No note, no call, no messages. He wouldn't just leave, Agnes expressed, not without first announcing his authority 5 times. In agreement, Webb snorted. At first, Miss Marple, who was sitting close to the window, said nothing. A tiny porcelain cup that had been left on the ledge had her undivided attention. Without sugar, lipstick, or half of a cup of tea, there is a thin border of yellowish residue at the bottom. I see. This is his, quietly, she inquired, following her stare. Webb, I can only fathom how chilly it must be, she remarked. She got to her feet and cautiously circled the room, taking care not to touch anything as he hurriedly departed, but not before she finished half a cup. The wall calendar caught her attention. Today was the date that was circled in red pen. Strange. She mumbled he didn't seem the sort to romanticize appointments. After removing the calendar from its hook, Webb turned to the previous pages. March had a scrawled note, F origin conflict, settled April inventory problem, Cordelia, discreetly with June, all we have is an arrow leading to the phrase cover that has been finalized. So far, it has all been meaningless. The community responded to Blake's disappearance with its customary brand of measured frenzy. He has absconded with the money. At the bakery, Mrs. Goodwin said severely, came prepared for France with everything. He could, alternatively, the admirer may have presented Mr. Nettleby, a customer of the firm that fixes watches. With what a hoard of wealth that is. Bet it was all planned. Perhaps Cordelia had some insight into his character. At the church floral committee, Dora Maynard muttered something ancient to Miss Marple about something he couldn't afford to let out. Maybe the ledger had more than just names. Maybe it was proof. Even though Miss Marple refrained from arguing, her thoughts shifted to Blake's quiet, wondering why he hadn't destroyed more if he had really fled. For what reason should we omit the ledgers and the tea? On this particular date, What had he circled? That evening, Sergeant Webb appeared at Miss Marple's cottage. Again this time, he appeared less put together. His shoes were caked in filth, and his collar was ajar. He stated, "We found his car," without providing any background knowledge. Left for dead behind the decrepit greenhouse next to Welbeck Farm, no footprints, no indications of conflict. Boot had no contents. With an arched eyebrow, Miss Marple, therefore, it cannot evade its elimination. Possible options include Webb exclaimed perhaps he discarded it, or someone desired to make it appear as though he had nodded. Was anything found in the footwell? After a moment, he stopped. A fragment of pale green ribbon that appears to be stitched, and a few crumbs of dried grass stashed beneath the break. A mid-row stop occurred in Miss Marple's knitting. Ribbon, it has been sent for testing. Yes. Might be beautiful trim off something, or lace edging, she muttered. Webb narrowed his eyes. The enthusiast, the needles were put aside by Miss Marple. I thought Cordelia only brought one fan with her, but everyone did. The catalogue said the museum had a set of 4 similar fans, but she only displayed one at a time. Unlocking the storage room the following morning, Agnes trembled with fear. She had returned to the museum the night before. One by one, she and Miss Marple opened the protected drawers of the not-on-exhibit collection on the second fan. There are 3 empty drawers. A mirror of the Chantilly lace once seen at the reception was missing. Agnes collapsed onto the closest bench. I had no idea she kept it here. She always made it seem like it was special and unique. Miss Marple drew the indentation where the case had sat, unless it's a knockoff. She whispered, "No one steals a second fan." The constable's office received a letter around mid. The return address was not included. Written on a folded page, "You're staring at the wrong thing." Museums don't hold the same significance as the past. Underneath the fan, a thin grey line. The fan was never Cordelia's. Make a 1947 inquiry with the postmaster. At Miss Marple's cottage, Sergeant Webb read the letter out loud. Seated in an uncomfortable triangle around the tea table were Webb, Agnes, and Miss Marple, according to his position at Kingsmead, who went by the name Anonymous. With no prints, perhaps, a remark or a jest, as Miss Marple put it. Someone wants us to turn the page backwards, not forward. Grinning glumly, Agnes said, "The postmaster's been there forever." After 2 years of retirement, Mr. Elcott said, "Then we'll ask him." With painstaking care, Miss Marple folded her napkin. "And we must ask one more thing," she continued. "Who was responsible for Chapter 8's fan, if Cordelia never owned it?" At the humble cottage on the outskirts of Lower Fallow Lane, where the late Mr. Lionel Elcott resided, ivy scrambled up the walls like rumours, and the gate moaned with its own disapproval. A guy with strong eyebrows and a gentle teapot. He was already sitting in the conservatory with a biscuit tin open and a pair of mismatched slippers at his feet, when Sergeant Webb and Miss Marple arrived at 10 o'clock. "Ah, Miss Marple," he replied, his voice growing brighter. "Haven't seen you since the Christmas raffle." "Mr. Elcott," she responded with kindness. "Remember us, and maybe be honest with us, for we need you." His laughter betrayed 2 things that diminish with time. "But do come in." While Miss Marple sat down, Sergeant Webb stood by. Between them, on the table, sat the folded letter. Webb announced, "We received an anonymous tip linking your name to 1947 and the year in question." Elcott furrowed his noggin. "It took 3 days to dig out the vicar's spaniel from the snow that fell during the harshest winter I can remember. Half of the village was covered in snow." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "Can you remember receiving anything out of the ordinary in the mail?" Maybe there was some kind of covert exchange taking place as Elcat's fingers gently tapped a rhythm on the table. You're talking about the parcel sitting forward, Webwitch package in early March. Elcat had a trunk full of brown leather foreign stamps addressed to Miss Vivian Grey, he moaned. That name remained because there was no Vivian Grey in the village. I checked twice, and still it was picked up. Elcat glanced toward Cordelia Fassett, the object of Miss Marple's inquiry. The atmosphere dimmed. She stated she was collecting on Miss Grey's behalf. I didn't think much of it at the time. The package was too heavy for books to handle, so she signed for it. However, a week later, I discovered the label thrown away behind the desk. The return address was stolen. It wasn't against the law to collect someone else's package as long as it was claimed correctly. And you didn't notify anyone, which made Webb grimace. When it came to Cordelia, people just didn't dare ask her any questions. The voice of Miss Marple exuded thoughtfulness. Foreign stamps, you said, Bayonne, France, postmarked sitting back. Webb. So Cordelia ended up with an item that wasn't supposed to be hers, a French gift intended for someone who may or may not have ever lived. The author said want in the village word of Edward Blake's disappearance had begun to curl in on itself, morphing into folklore before the week had even ended. Interpol will catch him. Dora Maynard said, as though she'd recently consulted with them, there are only so many ports after all. Mrs. Goodwin now stated she'd always thought he was not quite English during this time. Mr. Nettleby's note at the repair shop read, closed early today, watching the roads. But Miss Marple's attention remained fixed not on where Blake had gone, but on where the fan had come from after Miss Marple's warning about the floors being more dramatic than they ought to be. Agnes agreed to let her use the archive room for 1 hour that afternoon. Secrets slowly deteriorating, and the aroma of beeswax linen permeated the archive area. Carefully labeled drawers lined the walls in row after row. Among the acquisition records from 1946 to 1952, Miss Marple's gaze fell on one. Within were a stack of index cards, the majority of which contained standard information such as donor names, item descriptions, and delivery conditions. However, close to the back of one card, there was a ripped corner and a slightly different script, product details, a lace fan with a chantilly pattern, gilt handle, and pearl inlay. Estimated 1860s vintage. Shipped privately by Miss Fiji, origin unclear, prospective estate disposal, France in exceptional condition, repaired lock mechanism, until additional verification is completed. Please do not display. The Cordelia faucet was discreetly tucked behind. The paper was thin, ancient, and folded. The writing was French. Later that night, Miss Marple presented Sergeant Webb with the document. Can we date this? He asked, his gloved hands turning the paper over in hers. Possibly, but more importantly, it tells us 2 things, she replied. First, that someone, perhaps Vivian Grey herself, knew the fan had been intercepted. And second, that the original owner never consented to its transfer. Webb exhaled, which means Cordelia had possession of stolen property for than 30 years and may have exploited it. Miss Marple added, as leverage, as sin, as threat, as the rain started to fall that night. Miss Marple remained steadfastly at her window once again. As the sun dipped below the horizon, she beheld the hedgerows and the hazy streetlights beyond. In fact, history had etched its initials into the present rather than merely infiltrating it. Nothing happened, no shouts, no violence, no indications of intrusions, just the passing of a single object that had more than simply patterns and threads, carried the weight of treachery. Plus, the item had vanished once more. Chapter 9, located immediately off Merton Lane. The solicitor's office was partially concealed by an uneven hedge and an untrimmed wisteria-covered wall that had been in place before the coronation. Inside, everything smelled vaguely like paper and peppermint loans. After greeting Miss Marple and Sergeant Webb with a brief bow and a lengthier sigh, Mr. Leopold Smay, the local solicitor for more than 30 years, reached for the files and remarked, "I wonder how long it would take." He pulled out a manila folder bound with crimson string. Cordelia wasn't the kind to be delicate even when dealing with papers. The top sheet displayed Cordelia's last will and testament. Margaret Fawcett, executed the 3rd of November 1949, amended 12th. February, Miss Marple resized her spectacles for this year. "Can we review the changes?" What did she want? A new sheet was slipped across the desk by Smith. Webb leaned forward to read aloud the addendum, which was not yet officially filed, but clearly intended. "I kindly ask that, in the unfortunate case of my demise, the board not keep item number 12 from the fellow Glen Lace Museum, but rather that it be given to Agnes Bell for her discretionary disposition. Any prior assertions of museum ownership are superseded by this instruction." Quietness descended. The paper was delicately touched by Miss Marple. After realizing the fan wasn't rightfully hers, she attempted to fix it when Webb nodded. Smay cleared his throat. She preferred it not to be made public. They were asked to revisitize the incorporated scrutiny only in cases of dispute. "I questioned the rationale behind," she claimed. "I've kept it for too long," but she didn't reveal who had donated it. Miss Marple stated that Agnes would be able to handle the situation, but she did not confirm with Smith. A gust of wind had begun to blow outside the workplace. Sergeant Webb crossed his arms behind his back as they walked, and Miss Marple whispered, "That changes everything, indeed." As the village green flowed beneath long thin clouds and the steeple bell rang out. On the quarter hour. At the end, Cordelia attempted to return the fan without causing a scandal or anyone preventing her from doing so, even though it was never her right to show it. The removal of the fan and Edward Blake appears to have been more planned than before, as Webb's attitude becomes darker. On her way to the museum, Miss Marple stopped at the intersection of the cobblestone and mossy walk. Webb scowled at Sergeant. "Tell me, what if Blake wasn't the thief? It was at her death that he seized control, erasing records and hiding evidence. A man of innocence would never act in such a way." She denied it, saying that it may be the desperate person's behavior. When Miss Marple walked into the museum's office, Agnes Bell was sifting through donations. Agnes looked up at her with a hint of anxiety still visible on her face. "I heard about the will," Miss Marple said. Miss Marple nodded. "She left you the fan." As Agnes took her time sitting down, Miss Marple responded, "I don't know what to do with that. She meant you to choose. However, maybe the true gift wasn't the object itself, but rather the truth that made her confront." Agnes averted her gaze, her voice scarcely audible. "A few months back, she confided in me that preserving the fan had ruined something, not the museum, per se, but her feeling of righteousness, which I failed to comprehend at the time. She carried the weight of guilt with her." Mildly, Miss Marple remarked, "I can tell you that much." There was a pause, then Agnes said, "If Blake didn't kill her, then who did?" The question, "Do you know who Vivian Grey really was?" was Miss Marple's substitute for an immediate response. A wide expression crossed Agnes's face as she said, "You found the name." Miss Marple proclaimed, "She never existed." If Agnes was hesitant because someone remembered sending that letter, it would signify that the fan wasn't just stolen. She was a shadow, A cover maybe, even Cordelia's creation meant to conceal the original owner. Returning, it was desired. A second envelope, this one without a postmark, slipped under Sergeant Webb's office door that evening. Inside, there was a sepia image with curled corners. It portrayed a young woman, late 20s, hair brushed into a formal wave. Wearing a dark outfit, she held the identical lace fan atop her. Not even one line from 1947, it was presented to Miss Marple by Cordelia Webb just before sunset. She gave a quick glance before nodding. "I don't speak English," she whispered, peering. At the Parisian dress's silhouette, he narrowed his eyes. Miss Marple said with great care, "You believe she is the rightful owner. We are tackling a crime that originated from attempting to rectify a theft that was buried in time." Even after Webb placed the picture on the table, Blake's whereabouts remain a mystery. No, she agreed, unless Blake didn't vanish to escape, but to protect someone on that fateful night, Agnes stumbled upon a hidden letter within Cordelia's ancient ledger. The letter was brief, unsigned, and clearly written in Cordelia's distinctive hand. If anyone were to come looking for it, they should inform Jane. She knows how to decipher it. "I thought I had time," the letter read. "I always thought there was more time." Section 10. Miss Marple made her move during a peaceful morning. A delicate suggestion was delicately put like a pin on silk. There were no abrupt accusations or declarations. She arrived at the Lace Museum at 10 minutes before. Agnes was about to open the doors. They locked eyes. Expression was unnecessary. Miss Marple had already communicated with Sergeant Webb. The concept was not a performance. It was an echo, a reproduction of something that had previously happened once before. The locals had congregated by midday, even though Miss Marple often had afternoon teas. It was unusual for her to do so at the museum, and even more unusual for all the people involved in the events of the past few weeks to be on the guest list. Their nerves jangling were Dora and Reverend Maynard. Mrs. Thurbridge appeared in her third finest hat, already mumbling speculations. Agnes Bell, who appeared pale but composed, remained silently behind the closed display case in the room's middle. Eventually, as if called upon by the very air, she rose up. Without any prior notice, Edward Blake strode in, untarnished by travel, and donning his identical navy overcoat. His entry elicited a gasp so keen it might sever thread. "You're alive," Dora said. Sadly, for some, Blake expressed in a sarcastic manner. He spared Agnes no glance. His gaze fell upon Miss Marple. Webb came out of the archive room with his arms crossed and said nothing as he said, "You sent the letter, didn't you?" Miss Marple responded gently, "But I expected you would receive one." In a focused gaze, Blake surveyed the room, asking, "So, this is what a confrontation?" "No, Miss Marple. Lead, it's an unveiling." Agnes silently removed the fabric from the showcase. There, in its original, undamaged, and concealed form, was the lace fan. Everyone took a deep breath at once. "I don't understand," Mrs. Thurbridge exclaimed, adding that it had been ostensibly damaged. Dora whispered. Marple, Miss grinned. Her attention shifted to the room. According to her, neither the archives nor Cordelia's possessions contained this fan. Instead, someone who thought it was too crucial to destroy nor too risky to keep returned it. Her remarks were left unspoken. Vivian Gray, the intended recipient of the fan who was stolen in 1947, never got it. According to Cordelia, the reason she left it to Agnes is unclear, although it appears to have been motivated by opportunism or guilt. What is certain is that the fan was never formally recorded under her name, but she used it regularly as leverage. What Webb couldn't fix while alive, she quietly added to her writing. Blake took a big leap ahead. His face was serene, but a tremor passed through one hand. And didn't kill her as she cocked her head. Miss Marple, you were afraid you'd be held responsible. I was aware of her plans and attempted to persuade her to come out and gently release the fan, but she flatly refused, claiming she had made too many enemies to trust anybody with the truth. She was absolutely correct. In a low voice, Miss Marple, to which she responded, "Why am I here?" Miss Marple waved toward the fan to see who would react. It happened rapidly, too rapidly to be considered drama, a simple intake of breath with a puff. The rear of the room, Reverend Maynard's hand shot to his mouth, knocking his teacup off its saucer when he stammered. Everyone's attention shifted. It was not shock that caused the subsequent quiet. It was an acknowledgement when the pieces finally click into place, moving closer. Miss Marple, not only did you provide Cordelia with the contact information she needed to track down the fan's origin, but you were also privy to the fan's contents and, more importantly, its original owner. With that, Maynard retreated. Assisted with estate recoveries after the war, weren't you? I thought you were stationed in France. Giles, Dora said, with a slightly parted mouth. He glanced at her before gently turning to Miss Marple. She blackmailed me, he replied finally. She threatened to spill the beans about my actions unless I kept quiet about her fan. Have you finished? Webb inquired while Maynard's speech was hardly audible. I forged a single academic credential through my station. One lace parcel arrived. The family had disappeared, and I had written off a valuable possession from a confiscated estate as abandoned because I didn't think anyone would notice. Miss Marple stated that Cordelia hoarded the fan but not the secret because she planned to use it as a weapon during the war. I didn't believe it would make a difference, but it did. He referred to it as leverage. Bitterly, Maynard remarked, even vices have histories. She threatened to ruin me if I spoke out about the package. I'm a vicar, damn it. In response to Miss Marple's question, Webb advanced. Reverend, did you murder her? No, he protested in a flash. I was frightened of what she could say. Yes, but I assure you, I didn't poison her. In fact, I didn't even see her that day. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Perhaps you didn't, she said, though not just Cordelia's secret was reburied. Someone else's as well. So she glanced around the room one last time before saying calmly, the real killer hasn't spoken yet. This was chapter 11. The room fell silent after Miss Marple spoke, but it wasn't because anybody was confused. Rather, it was because everyone was watching for any sign of guilt, such as a cough, tremble, or flicker. However, Miss Marple herself was not paying attention to the onlookers. To her, Agnes Bell was Agnes, remained motionless at the fan display, her face impassive as her hands delicately rested on the table edge. From Reverend Maynard to Edward Blake and finally to Miss Marple, her eyes darted slowly and warily. The voice of S.H. Marple was gentle, almost friendly. A life lived in secrecy was Cordelia Facet's. Nonetheless, secrets are like lace-sleeve designs. When one sees a mismatch, one must wonder why. She made her way to the room's middle, where she presented a fan that was obviously not the original. That fan, the real one, was taken before the reception, replaced with a near-identical replica 2 days prior to the reopening. I think the switch was made. Just long enough for Cordelia to recognize it, and just long enough for someone else to panic with a tense voice. Edward Blake spoke. The keys, however, belonged solely to Agnes and herself. Slowly, Miss Marple swung around. Everyone looked at Agnes, but she said nothing. Miss Marple maintained her delicate tone. Even at this late stage, the fan was bequeathed to you by Cordelia in her will. Even though she thought Agnes's lips parted just a little, she still trusted you, Agnes. Maybe she didn't know you very well. I didn't, she began, but stopped. Miss Marple maintained a fixed expression. During your inventory work last winter, you matched the old photographs, so you must have known the truth about the fan before Cordelia did, right? The object that everyone thought was a generous gift was actually a stolen artifact from a battle. Agnes blinked quickly, but remained silent when you noticed the date on the repair invoice. You didn't intend to kill her, according to Miss Marple's gentle words, at first. I thought you were just going to return the fan anonymously or send it back to its rightful owner, but Cordelia shocked you by changing her will and intending to give it to you anyhow. She wanted to make things right in her own proud, complicated way. Miss Marple waited, letting the reality sink, but you couldn't wait. It was your expectation that she would reconsider. In anticipation of her reclaiming it, you took action. On that occasion, Agnes's voice sounded like a horse. Nobody had any idea who she was as she gently nodded. Miss Marple, Sergeant Webb approached Agnes Bell with reluctance, speaking softly rather than handcuffed. Agnes avoided making eye contact with him. Did you get what she was saying? She continued to watch Miss Marple. Everything she told everyone was a lie. She talked about preservation for decades, as if she were the protector of morality, and her reputation was founded on a stolen artifact that the vicar used to blackmail Blake. Softly, Miss Marple whispered, "You put the digitalis in her tea." Short amounts, enough to build up subtle, delayed. Agnes offered a short, broken laugh, with the exception of one night when she was preoccupied. Not even I was ever allowed to touch her cup. She just finished writing that blasted will clause, and that was enough, Miss Marple remarked, referring to the document that was visible on her desk. She proceeded to pour the tea and leave the tin open without making any note of it. When Agnes made even the slightest betrayal, her hands sank to her sides. She would have kept lying, she said. She would have carried it all to her grave and smiled doing it. But she didn't, Miss Marple said. She tried to return it, you just didn't believe she meant to. Endless quietness ensued. Webb refrained from touching her. Still, Agnes raised her head to glance up. Her red-rimmed eyes weren't furious. They were just exhausted. Later that evening, when the visitors were gently removed and Sergeant Webb accompanied Agnes to the station, Miss Marple lingered at the museum a little longer. The fan had been returned to its exhibition case, this time without ceremony. She stood alone beside it, the lacework shining faintly beneath the overhead lights. Even though it lacked pride, it retained its beauty and bore the weight of decisions taken in the past. Back by her side, Edward Blake's hands were in his pockets as he re-emerged. He admitted that he had been deceived as well. Miss Marple nodded once. Cordelia wasn't mean. She was terrified of being found out as ordinary. Agnes, she was attempting to be kind, but in doing so, she committed the greatest sin of her life, according to Miss Marple. She was certain that she was superior to everyone else. As she left the museum, a wind had picked up. It rattled the hedges, moved the old church bell, shifted the leaves like whispers, with one gloved palm resting on the iron latch. Miss Marple hesitated at the gate, and the village experienced its first tranquil, if unsettling, feeling since the beginning. Oh, absolutely not. 12th chapter. 3 days later, the inquest took place in the village hall. There was no pomp and circumstance, just a gathering of weathered chairs, shiny shoes, and expressionless features that sported their somnolence like borrowed coats. Agnes Bell confessed to providing digitalis to Cordelia Fawcett during a 3-week period. It had not been her plan, she claimed, for the sake of the museum's credibility and the village's dignity. She had planned to covertly return the fan. The noble aim, however, had been twisted into something fragile and poisoned by Cordelia's silence and her lack of explanation. Agnes was ordered to remain in custody while the Crown examined the complete inquiry into the manslaughter verdict. However, in Fowl Glen, the decision of the court was not what troubled the residents. The reason for it, when Miss Marple returned to her cottage, she and Sergeant Webb sat in the cosy, peaceful sitting room. Someone had started a new fire. In a delicate flutter, the lace curtains fluttered in the wind. According to Webb, you were right. It wasn't just a crime. It was the culmination of while Miss Marple sipped her tea. Agnes nodded in agreement. Her anger was not harsh. In her attempt to right a wrong, she ended up doing the same thing that she had criticized in possession. The fan, she reasoned, would absolve her of guilt. The result, as Miss Marple mumbled, was the exact reverse. She rewound to the first page of her notepad. The clues were too neat and organized, so I missed seeing it sooner, she remarked. The loss of Blake's presence after the lace is destroyed. Cordelius will, in an effort to redirect our attention, Webb drew closer, allow me to explain it to you again. Everything that then Miss Marple grinned you continue to assert the fan was her first tool. It became clear when we traced the name Vivian Grayan, alias, or perhaps a ghost to a French estate, that Cordelia had never owned the fan. Webb claimed that she had taken it and used it to build a legacy. Miss Marple agreed, but she may have later regretted or been afraid that she would be exposed, so she changed her will not to be charitable but to avoid a scandal. Webb mumbled under her breath as she left the task to Agnes in the hopes of closing the chapter. However, Agnes had previously read the book. Then Miss Marple went on months before Cordelia passed away. Agnes learned where the fan had come from. She made an effort to return it, but Cordelia lacked the bravery to do so. Agnes, who was angry, spiteful, and maybe even feeling justified, made a decision because Cordelia kept putting things off. Slowly, she poisoned her. To the best of Webb's ability, he managed to keep everyone in the dark. Until Blake vanished, Miss Marple continued, frowning. Webb, do you believe him now that he fled to save someone? I think he'd fled to avoid being the scapegoat. He was scared of Agnes's next move and, maybe, of the secrets Cordelia's ledgers held about him. The entire while, Webb remained mute. Miss Marple murmured on, and then there was Reverend Maynard. With a nod, Cordelia blackmailed Webb, who then said, but he didn't kill her. No, she responded, but she had influence over a lot of people. And when authority is based on keeping quiet, it takes just one person to ask the right question to stomp it out. With a gentle touch, she put the notepad away. The Lace Museum stayed closed the following morning because the fan was never about art. It was about power, secrets, and guilt. Temporarily closed for categorizing. Please honor the past, according to a note on the door penned by Agnes's deft hand. A small group of peasants strolled by as they passed the fan, which was once again kept in a secure archival drawer with the words provenance disputed written on it. Miss Marple stopped by the Victorage's rose garden on her way home. While tending to the petals, Dora Maynard quietly whispered, never looking up at Cordelia. Somebody must have decided that she needed her branches pruned because Dora was always so accurate. Miss Marple continued to kneel, gather a dropped petal, and delicately set it on the ground, without responding. She went back to her living room. That night, it had been a low-level fire. In a basket beside the fireplace, her needlework lay abandoned. With a sigh, she retrieved the anonymously provided photo from her drawer. The fan-wielding adolescent from 1947, the woman's name had eluded her until now. Even the darkest corners could be illuminated by certain tales. Before turning down the light, she returned the picture to its original envelope. The mystery concludes with the closing of Chapter 12.